He's
It's
planning
over.
to
I filed
divorce
for the
me?
divorce.
No, this can't be happening.
Alone in complete darkness, the coffee in her hands had gone cold hours ago. She hadn't noticed, because what she was hearing through her earbuds was something no wife should ever hear. Her husband's voice. Calm, measured, familiar, planning her divorce. Not with anger, not with emotion, but with the precision of a business transaction. Every word landed like a quiet betrayal, calculated and final. And in that moment, Margaret understood something most people learn too late. Some endings don't arrive with shouting, they come with spreadsheets. Tonight, you're about to hear the story of a woman who discovered the truth in silence and chose not to scream, but to outthink everyone who underestimated her. This is not a story about revenge. This is a story about recognition, about a woman who spent 15 years building someone else's empire, only to discover she was scheduled for demolition. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who was Margaret before that night? Why was her husband so certain she would never fight back? And how did one quiet woman turn a private betrayal into a reckoning no one saw coming? More importantly, was what happened next revenge? Or was it something far more powerful? Stay with this story until the end, because the final lesson may change how you see trust, marriage, and silence forever. What would you do if you discovered the person you loved most was methodically erasing you from your own life? Would you confront them immediately? Or would you do what Margaret did? Watch, wait, and prepare? Margaret Chen had been married for 15 years. Not the loud kind of marriage. Not the dramatic kind that makes people whisper at dinner parties. The dependable kind. The kind neighbors point to and say, "There's a couple that has it figured out." She met Andrew when ambition still felt romantic, before titles and boardrooms, before power changed the way he spoke to waiters and subordinates. They were both 28 when they married. Andrew was a junior associate at a consulting firm, working 70-hour weeks and dreaming of partnership. Margaret was a project manager at a nonprofit, the kind of job that paid in purpose rather than dollars. She believed in building a life slowly, brick by brick, room by room. She believed loyalty was louder than words, that showing up mattered more than being seen. While Andrew climbed, Margaret steadied the ladder. She hosted dinners where deals were quietly born over her homemade risotto and carefully selected wines. She edited speeches that earned standing ovations, catching the small errors that would have embarrassed him in front of investors. She listened to worries no executive would admit out loud, the fears about imposter syndrome, the anxiety about quarterly reports, the weight of managing 40 employees. People called her supportive. What they didn't see was how much of his success had passed through her hands first. How many of his best ideas had started as her observations during their evening walks? How often she had been the first to spot the flaw in his strategy or the opportunity he'd missed. Andrew knew it. That's what made his planning so methodical. He understood exactly how valuable she was, which is why he was careful enough to plan his exit without her ever seeing it coming. For 3 years, he had been building a parallel life, one where Margaret's contributions were footnotes rather than foundations. He had been strategic about it, gradually shifting credit, slowly repositioning himself as a self-made man rather than half of a partnership. In meetings, he stopped saying we and started saying I. In interviews, he mentioned his wife less and his personal drive more. It was so gradual that Margaret didn't notice the erasure until it was nearly complete. The recording wasn't meant for her. That was the cruelest part. Margaret had tucked a small voice-activated recorder into Andrew's travel bag 6 weeks earlier, not because she was suspicious, but because instinct sometimes whispers before proof arrives. She told herself it was ridiculous. Even as she did it, paranoid, the kind of thing desperate women did in movies. But there had been signs. Nothing concrete, just shifts. Andrew had started coming home later, smelling of perfume that wasn't hers, expensive and young. He'd become protective of his phone, angling it away when texts arrived, taking calls in the garage. He'd started going to the gym at odd hours, suddenly concerned about his appearance after years of dad-bod contentment. Still, Margaret had pushed the thoughts away. Marriages go through phases. People get busy. She was probably imagining things, until the night she decided to listen to what the recorder had captured. It was a Thursday. Andrew was in Boston for a conference. Margaret was home alone, sorting through old photos for their upcoming anniversary party. 15 years. They were supposed to celebrate at the restaurant where he'd proposed, renew their private vows to each other. She had already bought a new dress. She almost didn't check the recorder. It felt like admitting defeat, like crossing a line she couldn't uncross. But something pulled her toward it, maybe the same instinct that had made her plant it in the first place. She made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, put in her earbuds, and pressed play. For the first 20 minutes, there was nothing. Background noise from airports, muffled conversations with colleagues, the mundane soundtrack of business travel. Then, a woman's voice came through the static. Young, confident, unafraid. "Margaret, this is Jennifer. Jennifer from legal. I've reviewed everything, and honestly, the timing is perfect. If you file in the next 60 days, Massachusetts law works entirely in your favor. She's not on any of the major accounts. Her name isn't on the investment properties. Technically, she could argue for spousal support, but given that you've been the primary earner for over a decade, her claim would be minimal at best." Andrew's voice responded, calm and analytical, the same tone he used when discussing quarterly projections. "What about the house?" Jennifer didn't hesitate. "The house is tricky because she inherited the down payment from her mother, but you've been making the mortgage payments for 14 years. A good attorney could argue that sweat equity and financial investment outweigh the initial contribution. You'd likely get to keep it or at the very least force a sale and split. Either way, she walks away with far less than she thinks she deserves." There was a pause. Margaret could hear ice clinking in a glass. Then Andrew spoke again. "And what about timing? If I wait until after the Donovan merger closes, does that change anything?" Jennifer laughed. It was a light, flirtatious sound that made Margaret's stomach turn. "Smart thinking. If you wait until after the merger, your personal compensation package triples, and she has no claim to any of it. Marital assets are calculated up to the date of separation. Anything you earn after that is yours alone. File the day after the ink dries. By the time she understands what's happening, you'll already be protected." Andrew's response was quiet but clear. "She won't fight. Margaret doesn't do conflict. She'll be hurt, but she'll sign whatever I put in front of her. She always does." The recording continued for another 12 minutes. They discussed logistics, attorney recommendations, how to handle mutual friends, where Andrew would live after he moved out. They talked about Margaret's life as if she were already gone, as if her 15 years of partnership were nothing more than a line item to be managed and minimized. And when the recording finally ended, Margaret didn't cry. Not yet. She sat in the dark and listened to it again. And again, because denial needs repetition before it collapses. By the fourth listen, something inside her had shifted. The woman who believed loyalty was louder than words was gone. In her place sat someone colder, sharper, more focused. Margaret didn't confront Andrew when he returned from Boston. That's what made her dangerous. She smiled at breakfast, asked about his trip, listened to his fabricated stories about client meetings and hotel room service. She watched him lie to her face with the same calm expression he used during investor pitches, and she memorized every detail. She realized something profound in those early days after the recording. Her silence had never been weakness. It had been observation. While everyone else was talking, she had been watching, learning, cataloging. She knew things about Andrew that he'd forgotten he'd told her. She knew which clients were unhappy, which board members wanted him replaced, which financial decisions were riskier than they appeared. For 15 years, she had been his confessor, his strategist, his safe place to admit doubt. And now, all of that knowledge became ammunition. But Margaret didn't rush. Rushing was what amateurs did. Instead, she began to document everything with the precision of an auditor. She created a secure cloud folder that Andrew would never access. She began scanning documents, forwarding herself emails from their shared accounts, screenshotting text messages. She photographed bank statements, investment portfolios, property deeds. She compiled a timeline of their marriage, complete with receipts, photos, and third-party verification of her contributions to his career. She reached out quietly, not for comfort, but for clarity. She scheduled a consultation with 3 different divorce attorneys, not to hire them, but to learn. She discovered that Massachusetts was an equitable distribution state, meaning assets didn't have to be split 50-50, but rather fairly based on contribution. She learned that her unpaid labor, her career sacrifices, her role in building his professional network, all of it could be quantified and valued. She learned that judges looked unfavorably on spouses who hid assets or planned divorces in secret to maximize their financial advantage. She learned that recordings, even ones obtained without consent, could be admitted as evidence in civil cases under certain circumstances. Margaret also did something Andrew never expected. She started attending his work events again. the ones she'd been quietly excluded from over the past 2 years. She showed up at the company holiday party, wearing a dress that reminded everyone why Andrew had married her. She charmed the board members, laughed at the right jokes, asked intelligent questions about the Donovan merger. She reminded them that she existed, that she wasn't just Andrew's quiet wife, but a person with her own intelligence and presence. She made sure people saw them together, happy, united, because she knew what was coming, and she wanted witnesses to the narrative Andrew was trying to rewrite. During this time, Margaret also reconnected with old friends and colleagues from her nonprofit days. She hadn't realized how isolated she'd become until she started reaching out again. These were people who remembered her before Andrew, who knew her as capable and strong, not just as someone's supportive spouse. She started having lunch with her former boss, who immediately offered her consulting work. She began rebuilding a professional identity separate from her marriage. Not because she planned to leave, but because she was preparing for the moment when Andrew would force her hand. She was creating options, building a safety net, ensuring that when the ground fell out from under her, she wouldn't fall far. The Donovan merger closed on a Tuesday in March. Margaret knew because Andrew came home with champagne and talked about it through dinner, his eyes bright with excitement, his voice full of plans for the future. He didn't say our future, he said my future, she noticed. That night, after he'd gone to bed, Margaret sat in her home office and reviewed everything she'd compiled over the past 2 months. 47 documents, 18 recordings, 6 witness statements from colleagues who confirmed her role in Andrew's major career decisions, a forensic accountant's preliminary assessment showing that Margaret's unpaid contributions to the household had allowed Andrew to invest aggressively in his career, resulting in wealth that wouldn't have existed without her support. She had enough, more than enough, but she didn't move yet. She waited 3 more days, watching Andrew's mood shift from celebratory to tense. She could see him building up to something, rehearsing conversations in his head. On Friday evening, he asked her to sit down. They needed to talk. There it was, the moment he'd been planning for months, maybe years. Margaret sat across from him at the dining table they'd picked out together a decade ago, the one she'd refinished by hand when they couldn't afford to buy new furniture. She folded her hands and waited. Andrew cleared his throat. He'd prepared a speech, she could tell. He started with, "I've been doing a lot of thinking." He moved into "We've grown apart." He landed on, "I think it's best if we separate." He was gentle about it, or at least he tried to be. He told her she deserved someone who could give her more attention. He said he'd been unfair to her, prioritizing his career. He promised they could do this civilly, that he'd make sure she was taken care of. He slid a folder across the table. Divorce papers, already drafted, already signed on his end. He'd even bookmarked the places where she needed to sign. Margaret looked at the papers but didn't touch them. Then she looked at Andrew, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in years. She saw the calculation behind the sympathy, the relief he was trying to hide, the impatience to have this conversation over. She saw a stranger wearing her husband's face. Margaret stood up slowly. She walked to her own office and returned with a folder of her own, much thicker than his. She placed it on the table between them. Andrew frowned. "What's this?" Margaret's voice was calm, steady, nothing like the emotional breakdown he'd clearly anticipated. "This is everything you forgot I knew. Inside that folder is a complete financial record of our marriage. Your offshore accounts, the ones you think I don't know about. The investment properties titled under your mother's name that we both know you're managing. The stock options you've been hiding in deferred compensation packages. Also, inside that folder are recordings of your conversations with Jennifer. All of them, including the ones where you discuss how to minimize my settlement, how to hide assets, and how you're certain I won't fight back because, and I quote, Margaret doesn't do conflict." The color drained from Andrew's face. She continued. "Also included is a detailed log of my contributions to your career. Emails I edited, presentations I helped create, client relationships I helped you build. There are sworn statements from colleagues confirming that several of your biggest deals originated from strategies I developed. There's an economic analysis showing that my unpaid labor and career sacrifice allowed you to take financial risks that directly led to your current net worth. And finally, there's a letter from my attorney outlining exactly what an equitable distribution would look like if we go to court. Spoiler alert, Andrew, it's not the 20% you're offering me in those papers." Andrew tried to speak, but Margaret held up her hand. "I'm not finished. You were right about one thing. I don't do conflict. I don't enjoy fighting. But what you mistook for weakness was actually patience. You thought I wasn't paying attention. You thought I was too comfortable, Too dependent, too afraid to challenge you, you built your exit strategy on the assumption that I would disappear quietly. But here's what you didn't consider. I've spent 15 years learning exactly how you think. I know how you negotiate. I know your pressure points. I know which secrets you've kept from your board, which mistakes you've covered up, which professional relationships are more fragile than they appear. Margaret leaned forward. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to tear up those papers. We're going to negotiate a real settlement, one that actually reflects my contribution to the wealth we built together. And we're going to do it fairly. Or, I'm going to make sure that every person who matters in your professional world knows exactly how you conduct your personal business. I won't be cruel about it. I won't be emotional. I'll simply tell the truth. And we both know that your reputation can't survive the truth. The room was silent except for the sound of Andrew's breathing, quick and shallow. Finally, he spoke. You've been planning this. Margaret smiled, but there was no warmth in it. No, Andrew, you've been planning this. I've just been paying attention. The divorce took 9 months to finalize. Not because of legal complications, but because Andrew kept trying to renegotiate, kept trying to find loopholes, kept hoping Margaret would eventually accept less just to make it end. She never did. Every time he pushed back, she added another item to the settlement. Every time he tried to hide an asset, she found it and documented it. She was methodical, relentless, patient. Jennifer from legal tried to help him at first, but once she realized the scope of what Margaret had compiled, she quietly recommended he settle. No attorney wants to go to court with a case they know they'll lose, especially not one involving secret recordings and hidden assets. In the end, Margaret walked away with 48% of their combined assets, including the house, half of Andrew's unvested stock options, and a significant portion of his retirement accounts. More importantly, she walked away with her professional reputation intact. The divorce settlement included a non-disparagement clause that worked both ways, but Margaret had been careful never to disparage Andrew publicly anyway. She simply let the facts speak. She didn't need to tell people what happened. The settlement numbers told the story clearly enough. Within 6 months of the divorce being finalized, Margaret had launched her own consulting firm, specializing in strategic planning for nonprofits and small businesses. Her first 3 clients came from referrals from Andrew's former colleagues, people who had watched the divorce unfold and been impressed by her professionalism. She discovered something surprising in those early months of independence. She was good at this, really good, without having to filter every idea through someone else's ego, without having to make herself smaller to make someone else comfortable. She flourished. Her business grew quickly, not because she was ruthless, but because she was excellent. She had spent 15 years honing skills in the background, and now those skills had a spotlight. A year after the divorce, Margaret ran into Andrew at a professional conference. It was the first time they'd seen each other since the final settlement meeting. He looked older, tired. The merger that was supposed to transform his career had fallen apart 6 months after it closed. The board had replaced him with a younger executive. He was consulting now too, but struggling to find clients in a market that remembered his reputation. They exchanged polite pleasantries. How are you? I'm well. You look good. Thank you. Before they parted, Andrew said something Margaret hadn't expected. I underestimated you. It wasn't an apology, but it was close. Margaret nodded. Yes, you did, but that says more about you than it does about me. She walked away without looking back. Later, someone asked her if she felt vindicated, if she'd gotten revenge. Margaret thought about it carefully before answering. Revenge would have been trying to destroy him. What I did was refuse to be destroyed. There's a difference. Revenge is about the other person. What I did was about remembering my own worth. 2 years after that night with the earbuds, Margaret was sitting in a coffee shop, working on a proposal for a new client. A young woman at the next table was crying quietly, trying not to make a scene. Margaret recognized something in her posture, that particular kind of devastation that comes from betrayal. Without thinking too much about it, Margaret walked over. I'm sorry to intrude, but are you okay? The woman looked up, embarrassed. I'm fine. Just personal stuff. Margaret nodded. Can I sit for a moment? The woman hesitated, then gestured to the empty chair. They sat in silence for a minute. Then Margaret spoke. Whatever happened, it's not a reflection of your worth. It's information. Information about someone else's character, about the situation you're in, but not about you. The woman's eyes filled with fresh tears. My husband is leaving me. We've been married for 8 years, and he just told me last night that he's been unhappy for years. He has someone else. He wants the house. He says I knew this wasn't working. But I didn't. I really didn't. Margaret felt a familiar ache in her chest. I'm sorry. That's one of the worst kinds of pain, to discover that your reality wasn't shared. The woman wiped her eyes. Did this happen to you too? Margaret nodded. Something similar. And I'm guessing he's already 3 steps ahead. Already has an attorney. Already has a plan for how this goes. The woman looked startled. How did you know? Because people who plan betrayals are usually very thorough. They'd had time to prepare while you're still processing the shock. But here's what I learned. Their head start doesn't have to be your disadvantage. You can catch up, you can pay attention, you can document everything and build your own strategy. You don't have to react from a place of panic. Margaret pulled out a business card and wrote something on the back. This is my attorney's name. Tell her I sent you. She'll give you a consultation for free. And here's my number. If you need someone to talk to, someone who's been through this, call me. You don't have to do this alone. The woman took the card with shaking hands. Why are you being so kind to me? You don't even know me. Margaret smiled. Because someone should have done this for me. Because women need to stop being isolated in their pain. Because your husband is betting on you being too devastated to think clearly. Prove him wrong. The woman nodded slowly, something shifting in her expression. Margaret recognized that shift. It was the moment when shock began transforming into resolve. She'd seen it in her own mirror 2 years ago. She stood to leave, but the woman stopped her. Can I ask you something? Did it get better? Did you get through it? Margaret thought about her answer carefully. It got different. Different in ways I couldn't have imagined when I was where you are now. I won't lie and say it didn't hurt, or that the hurt went away quickly. But I discovered that I was stronger than I thought. I discovered that the life I was so afraid of losing was actually limiting me. I discovered that starting over wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of a better chapter. The woman was crying again, but differently now. Thank you. I don't even know your name, but thank you, Margaret told her, and then she left the coffee shop, carrying her laptop and her proposal, carrying a life she'd built from the ashes of the one that burned down. There's a question people always ask when they hear Margaret's story. Did she ever forgive Andrew? The truth is complicated. Margaret didn't forgive him in the traditional sense, the kind where you reconcile and move forward as if nothing happened. But she released the anger. Not because he deserved forgiveness, but because carrying that weight wasn't serving her anymore. She stopped hoping he would understand what he'd done wrong. She stopped waiting for an apology that would never be adequate. She accepted that some people will only ever see their own perspective. And that's not her problem to solve. What Margaret did instead was forgive herself. She forgave herself for not seeing the signs sooner. She forgave herself for the years she spent making herself smaller. She forgave herself for believing that loyalty alone would be enough. And in doing that, she discovered something profound. The opposite of betrayal isn't revenge. It's self-recovery. It's remembering who you were before someone convinced you to be less. It's rebuilding a life where you don't need permission to take up space. So, let me ask you, because this story isn't just about Margaret. It's about all of us. What would you have done in her place? Would you have confronted the truth immediately, or would you have waited, watched, and prepared? Do you believe betrayal reveals character, or does it create it? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between being kind and being strategic? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every one, and your perspective might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if this story moved you, challenged you, or stayed with you longer than you expected, subscribe for more stories that speak to real life, real choices, and quiet strength. Because some stories aren't just meant to be watched. They're meant to be remembered. They're meant to remind us that we're more capable than we think, that silence can be strength, that patience can be power. Margaret's story is one woman's experience, but the lesson belongs to all of us. You are not obligated to stay small to make others comfortable. You are not required to accept less than you deserve. And when someone bets against you, the most powerful response isn't anger. It's proving them wrong. Until next time, remember that your worth isn't determined by who stays or who leaves. It's determined by how you choose to see yourself when everything falls apart.